street. Whew. Has everyone had an awesome week?
Yes.
Cool. So let me tell you, going last has a lot of advantages, but a couple big disadvantages too. Got to see a lot of really cool sessions this week and kind of adjust mine on the fly. And as a first-time presenter, that was really helpful. It was also really unhelpful because at 4 a.m. yesterday morning, I realized my slides weren't quite up to par with everyone else's, so I had to do a complete visual redesign. So we're gonna fly through this and hope that some of the new visual cues don't throw me off. But yeah, I'm Dimitri Altum. I'm a systems engineer at Ramp. But first and foremost, I am a dog dad. I have Navi on the right, the bigger one, and Fenrir on the left, the smaller one. They're miniature American Shepherds, and they are my world and life. Professionally, I've spent time at Meijer, which is a large grocery chain in the Midwest. So hello to all my Midwest folks out there. IBM. And if you've heard my name in the Mac admins community at all, it is probably from my time at Fleetsmith, where I was in customer support, helping a lot of fellow Mac admins manage their fleets. So now that you know a bit about me, let's talk a little bit about the journey we're gonna go on today and kind of what it's all about. It was something that started kind of as a desire to learn to start code early on in life, and professionally realization that I needed to grow and evolve. And then traditional resources just weren't helping with that growth and that evolution. Things like school and textbooks and online courses just weren't clicking for me. I was kind of stuck spinning my wheels in the mud and just wasn't getting any traction on the growth that I knew I needed and wanted. And now that I've been at least semi-successful in starting to write code and implementing tools for our IT team, I wanted to kind of talk about some of the things I've done and maybe inspire a few people, give you some ideas on how you might spark some of that growth in your own careers. So some of the timeline that we're going to go through. Talking about when I learned to write code in high school for the first time and seeing that as a viable career path. Beginning my career and very quickly deciding that, okay, writing code isn't realistic for me right now. The finding of the Mac admins community, which really sparked a career launch for me in that realization of evolution and growth that I talked about. And then we'll spend the most of the time here in this second part, the second story, where I started to do things with low-code tools and developed a lot of foundational skills that I wasn't even aware of, and then the starting to write code again. So where did it begin? Like I said, in high school, I started taking programming classes. I took some Visual Basic and C++ classes. I took part in an after-school program called Business Professionals of America and even won a few competitions. I was pretty quickly enthralled. I realized that I loved to build things. But pretty quickly after that, I dropped out of college. It just wasn't working for me. I moved away from home at 19, and I realized I needed a stable career in order to stabilize myself and continue to exist the way I wanted to exist. And so software engineering was just not gonna be in the cards for me at that moment. I found a traditional IT help desk role and started my more traditional IT career. And that kind of brings us to the start of no code. It's something we've really all heard before. Don't get me wrong, I loved my first job. I worked there for 6 years over a variety of roles. I started in the help desk. I moved into a NOC, into desktop support, and all the way up to a systems administrator, managing 15,000 iPads across 300 grocery stores. But it wasn't exactly an environment that sparked a lot of learning or growth. They didn't value automation. It was very old school. And ClickOps was just the accepted way of things. The longer it took you to get something done, within reason, well, that was just job security. So I started to seek out my own growth. We'd run into problems on our Macs with things like File Vault, and I'd go learn to write a bash script to try to help with that. But as I was starting to learn these things like writing bash scripts, I was running into a lot of questions at the same time that I didn't have answers to. Things like, how do I run this when I'm on vacation? Or how do I automate this because some of my team members may not know how to do it? Or even as simple as, how do I run this not from my computer? How do I make it go from somewhere else? And so I went looking, and I found the Mac admins community. And what did the Mac admins community show me? Well, I saw a lot of really cool things that people were doing. Greg with Monkey, and Tim Perfit with MDS, Eric Gomez with Install Apps, and UMAD, and so many more. And I also saw the difficulty of managing devices at these large scales. You have Graham at Airbnb, Rich at SAP, Nick McSpadden at Facebook. There was this whole world that I had never encountered of people doing these incredible things that I thought were out of reach for me when I had joined IT. But most importantly, I found that need to grow and evolve. So let's pause for a second and talk about that. The role of IT. See, it started as a personal goal that I needed to grow and I needed to evolve. But over the years, I've grown in the belief that this is a shift in our industry, not just for me alone. This is something that IT is moving towards. You see, IT started to help people learn to use technology. Personal computing sparked the growth of our field. It made things like help desk a viable career option and an entry point to learn. But we've been seen as a cost center for so long. It's something that companies pour money into, and they don't really see that they get value back from us. Now, we're in a technological revolution. With the increased presence and significance of technology, we're better suited now than ever to become a force multiplier for our companies and really show that we can drive value. We can help not just IT, but so many others in the company help automate things, build new tools, and really drive company efficiency. And so, as part of that, I decided I was going to leave the enterprise world. I was done being stuck in a silo where only what I was given was my task. So I went and joined a startup. But things didn't quite go as well as I had expected. Teams were leaner, timelines were shorter, and personal stakes were higher. There weren't a lot of other people around, so when things went wrong, it was squarely on my shoulders. A lot of startups fail, and I didn't want that to be me. Things seemed worse than before. I couldn't keep up with everything that was going on. Not only was I not learning the skills I thought I would learn, but I was stuck in a rut and didn't have the space to grow. So why couldn't I keep up? Well, plain and simple, I was stuck doing tasks that I hadn't quite expected. Things like onboarding and offboarding were extremely time-consuming. At one point, I was a sole IT person for a company of 200. Most of my days were spent just doing these repetitive tasks of creating accounts, shutting accounts down, handling turnover. It just wasn't working for me. And so I had to find a solution. I knew it was sink or swim. And so I went and I found low-code as a tool. Now, a lot of you are probably asking, why low-code, or what is low-code? So to answer the what is low-code, I kind of liken it to building IKEA furniture. Comes with a lot of prefabricated pieces, some decent instructions sometimes. They provide a tool that will aggravate you to no end, so you should probably bring your own. It might make it a little bit easier. And you'll definitely get frustrated along the way. As for why low code, well, it provided an easy jumping platform with limited resources. So let's expand on that a little bit. For one, it led to faster development time, both for tools and my personal skills. I was able to drag and drop things and create these flows that I hadn't really envisioned before. I was able to get those repetitive tasks off my plate. It also, that drag and drop interface, allowed non-technical users to chime in, to look and see. They could see the lines showing where data was flowing. They didn't need to learn to write code. And so it was a lot easier to gather more input and more information from those around me on how something should be built or why something might go wrong for a situation that I hadn't seen coming for maybe a tool I wasn't familiar with. And then last, it's incredibly easy, incredibly easy to spin up and shut down. With a click of a button, I could turn a workflow on or turn a workflow off. I didn't need to go learn AWS and learn infrastructure and learn Lambdas. It was just a toggle. So where do I start, though? I found Okta Workflows, and I was a little bit overwhelmed. There were a lot of cards. There were a lot of apps. It was just a lot of stuff to do. And it kind of felt like I hadn't had my coffee yet. My brain wasn't really kicked into gear. Now, I will admit that's a bit of a lie. I don't drink coffee, so I kind of just imagine that's what it felt like. We're gonna hide that so no one knows I lied. So what did I do? I started to look at what other people were doing. I joined the Okta Workflows channel in the MacAdmins Slack community. I looked at the templates that the Okta Workflows team had put out, which admittedly at the time were pretty barren. Workflows was a fairly new product when I first started using it. But it at least gave me some ideas. It showed me what a functioning flow would look like and really how to kickstart one. So now that I had some ideas on what it looked like and the things I might be able to accomplish, what did I do? Well, I dived right in and solved world hunger, of course. That's where everyone starts, right? With the most complicated, but maybe not. I started small. I made myself a checklist of things that were taking up the majority of my time that I felt were simple and could probably be taken care of pretty easily without too much work. Things like account creation and email alias creation. Things like transferring Google Drive when an employee left to their manager, setting up email delegates, even some basic reporting structures. So along the way, as I was building out these pretty simple tools, I realized something though. A lot of times in IT, we ask our users to come to us, and it wasn't very beneficial. We needed to go to where our users were. And in the startup world, a lot of times that was in Slack. So I kind of adopted the SSO methodology. I want everything under one roof. I'm going to start building Slack bots to take things to my users. But even with my Slack bots, I started small. It was simple things like sending people messages when their Okta password changed, reminding them that, hey, your Okta and Mac passwords don't sync, so if you want them to be the same, go change your Mac password. And I even discovered some fun, somewhat malicious attack vectors. And the somewhat can apply to either the fun or the malicious there. You see, a while ago in Slack, you could hyperlink emojis. However, Slack wouldn't display them as a hyperlink of any sort. You could hover your cursor over them, nothing would show up. You could inspect them, nothing would show up. It just wouldn't do anything until you clicked it and all of a sudden something happened. So I used that to prank my coworkers a few times. It was pretty fun. They've since changed it. They now show up much easier to see that they're hyperlinks. So a little less fun to try to prank your coworkers. So I had taken some of the repetitive tasks off my plate with basic workflows. And I had this kind of North Star idea, telling myself, this is where I want to start building. I want to move forward in this way. I could look for ways to help not just myself and my colleagues in IT, but the rest of the company in automating things and building things like Slack bots. It's my favorite transition. I just had to. They had the planes there. I had to make them fly off the screen. So anyways, as I started to build more Slack bots, they got a little more advanced. And it turns out, so did my skills, without really even realizing it. I would do things like build a Slack bot where a user clicked a button, and it would send data to an API endpoint. And the API endpoint would have logic to take action based on what the user had submitted. I was learning these things without really even realizing it. And they were getting more and more advanced. I was building home screens for Slack apps that were individualized to users. So let's kind of talk about some of those things I built. In the beginning, there were a lot of jumbled messes that looked like this, things flowing in every which way. No one knew what was going on except me, and documentation was poor. So OffRamp was the first thing I built, and to this day, probably my second favorite thing I've ever built. We'll talk a little bit more about the first later. It's incredibly dumb, but at least one of you in here will chuckle, I hope. So OffRamp, I have to give a lot of credit to a guy named Pete Veary on the MacAdmin Slack. He had provided this incredible Dropbox document guide that walked through building a Slack bot for how to offboard users. And so a lot of my initial design came from that guide. And then I slowly adjusted it over the years to suit my company's needs and my needs better. Now, before I dive too deep into what OffRamp does and some of the things I took from it, I want to explain a little bit about Slack apps. Slack has what they call an interactivity entry point. It's basically just a URL for some sort of API endpoint. Every request for that Slack app goes to that one endpoint. It doesn't matter if it's a button, if it's 5 different buttons, a shortcut, a message, it all funnels into the same place. And so that's where you had to start building this logic to learn to read what the user was doing and interact based on that. One of the things I took early on from building OffRamp was modularization. When I first started, I was trying to cram everything into one flow. I said, well, it's all in one place. I can see it easy. It's there. But I pretty quickly realized that that wasn't the case. It was really difficult to test things and really difficult to troubleshoot with everything in one place. So I had to start breaking it down into modules and submodules. When it was all in one flow, I was inserting false breakpoints. I was doing continue if 1 equals to 2, which I would hope is never going to trigger. So the first module I built was the schedule module. I remembered the pain of being on the East Coast, working for a West Coast company, and having to log in at 8 p.m. to go offboard someone because I had no way of scheduling anything or setting things up for automatic. And I wanted to make sure that myself and anyone on my team had the freedom to leave work when appropriate and know that a scheduled task would occur. No one needed to stay on late night for these things to happen. I didn't want to have to go manually trigger things. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when a user actually clicks the schedule button. A big whole lot of stuff that I don't need to go through all of it, but the gist is things are sent to an API endpoint, it reads, it sends some stuff back, and just kind of loops through that same thing until it reaches the end. And what does that look like in a low-code tool? It's a little something like this. It's a little complicated with a lot of different branches and a lot of different logic. It's kind of chaotic to look at. The next module I worked on was the perform module. I can't just schedule an offboard. It actually needs to do something. Obviously, that's the whole point of offboarding. We need to worry about security. So the perform would read that scheduled task that we had created earlier and kick off a flow. I could have multiple things happening simultaneously. I could have the user's Google account being transferred. I could have them being removed from Google Workspace groups. I could have their Kanji devices being locked. Shout out Weldon, I see you out there.
See you.
So what does that look like? Not quite as complicated, but what you don't see behind that is that each of these call flow async modules are then breaking down into many different streams, many different things happening. It was kind of like a tree root system. There are a lot of branching paths. But one of the things I quickly realized is that it's not just about what the tool does, it's also about what the tool doesn't do. Just because you ignore an unlocked door doesn't mean someone's not going to walk through it. You have to make sure that all your bases are covered, whether that be alerting, whether that be a manual process. You need to know about it. But also, along the way, I learned some fun things. It's not just about building to build. There was a lot of learning and a lot of cool things I kind of stumbled into, which, cool is probably a pretty nerdy definition here. One of the things I found was the dynamic setting of the date selector. When someone would go to schedule an offboard, the first iteration was just me manually inputting an arbitrarily chosen date every few months. I would go in and update the code to say, oh yeah, select this date. It's now June, so we probably shouldn't start in January. But along the way, I realized, well, every time someone's clicking schedule, I'm getting information about when they clicked it. Why can't I use that to then set the date so that it always starts from today? We're not going to offboard in the past. We're going to offboard from now forward. So why can't I use today as the beginning? Another one was the get offboard channel ID flow. This came about when one time I needed to adjust where the alerts were going into a different Slack channel. I had about 40 different alerts built into this flow, and so I had to go in and individually change 40 different cards. And immediately, as soon as I was done doing that, I said, I have to find a better way. This is awful. And so what I realized was, well, I could put this value somewhere else and just have the workflow read it. That way, I just have one source of truth for this value. So the next time I needed to go change it, I just changed it in one place, and all 40 just read that value properly. And like I said, even pranking your coworkers. So to my colleagues, if and when you watch this in the future, please go back to our last offboard and click on the emojis. Something fun will happen. To the crowd, I'm sorry, no spoilers. I may tell you after the mic's turned off at the end. But as with every tool, there are some concerns. Things like who gets access and how do I limit access? We don't want anyone in the company being able to offboard someone. So who gets access was pretty easy. It was just a conversation with our security teams, our compliance teams, making sure we knew who could A, see who was being offboarded, and B, schedule who was being offboarded. But limiting access was a little more difficult. See, originally, this was planned to just be a bot in a private channel. So I said, well, just only certain people are in that channel. No big worries, easy peasy. But I realized that, well, I could probably do one better. I knew I wanted to use that Slack app homepage that I had showed earlier, so why couldn't I just use that as the entry point to the app rather than a channel? You see, the way Slack works is anytime someone opens that app homepage, it sends a payload of data to the app's API endpoint with basic information like who the user is. So I was able to read that information and say, okay, based on some attributes like department or team or title, I can choose what to display to the user, and I can even show their name directly in there for them, make it nice and customizable and individualized. So what were some of the lessons I took going forward to my writing code journey? Well, for one, it was working with JSON data. Being brand new to JSON, I hadn't really run into it all that much before. I didn't know how to write it or how to read it or why I kept getting all these errors when I kept trying to build these Slack blocks. I also found cool tools like the Slack Block Kit Builder, which helped me build a beautiful visual message and see what the code was on the back end side by side. It helped really form those connections on what was what. Things like linters. For those of you who don't know what a linter is, it's kind of like Clippy from the old Microsoft Word days, except instead of telling you you have something spelled wrong, it just tells you have something formatted incorrectly for the language you're working in. And things like JSON visualizers to help me see how the data flowed in these steps. I learned about objects and lists and so much more. One of the other things I learned about was expected input. I learned about the structured data. And expected input was kind of crucial. Like I mentioned earlier, it was originally just in a channel where people would send a message. And it would say, hey, please format it this way. But I pretty quickly learned that leaving things open to interpretation is not the best when you want structured data. People are going to interpret things a lot differently every single time, and all of a sudden, you have no idea what's coming into your tool. And as the old saying goes, garbage in, garbage out. So I had to figure out how to handle that, and that's when that Slack app home came in. But also error handling. That garbage in, garbage out really quickly taught me that, hey, I need to know when something unexpected is coming into the app. If I just let it think it's always going to be expected data, things are going to fail. So I need to know when those things fail and why they failed. I also stumbled into some advanced topics. Along the way, I stumbled into a fun engineering topic about monolithic versus microservices. I didn't know whether it was better to have a ton of flows that all were ingestion points or just one that then fed to each individual flow. Spoilers, at small scale for us, we decided performance didn't really matter. It was going to perform the same either way, so we wanted what was easier to troubleshoot and read. And I really kept that core to a lot of tools that I built in the future, was making sure that troubleshooting and testing were really easy to do. The next tool I built was called Skeleton Key, or Ramp Access Immediately, Please. Now, you might notice, off-ramp, ramp access immediately, please. They both have ramp in them. This is an acronym for ramp. I do that because my boss hates it, and I love to rile him up. So this was a file vault recovery tool. Some credit goes to Gabriel on the Mac admin Slack for answering what I think were some really silly questions along the way. So one night I was out walking the dogs at about 9 p.m. and I saw that someone had submitted an IT ticket saying they had been locked out of their laptop and they needed a recovery key to get back in. Now, I wasn't available to go get that because I wasn't near my computer and most of my team was offline. I thought, well, that's silly. In today's day and age, we shouldn't be prohibiting users from working when they want to work. We need to enable people, especially in the remote world where you may have people across all time zones. I didn't want to be a prohibitive barrier to people getting the work done that they needed to get done when they wanted to get it done. So I said, okay, I need to build something for this. I need to figure out a way to get those people their file vault recovery key when they request it. But there's some concerns. I can't just have a tool out there that gives a random person a recovery key that's obviously very insecure. So I said, well, we have a 2FA app on everyone's phone already. We use Okta Verify, so maybe there's a way I can hook into that and use that as a verification system. So I built something out. They'd submit a ticket of a certain type, and they'd get a Slack message saying, hey, looks like you may be locked out of your laptop. I can help verify that you are you, and then I'll send you instructions on how to get that fixed without any need to involve IT at all. So what actually happens? Well, when they click that send verify, it actually utilizes the Okta API. And this is where I started diving really heavy into APIs and really understanding the things that they were capable of. Slack would get their user ID. I would transform that user ID into an Okta ID, and I would look up what factors they had enrolled on their account. I would do some sorting and find which one was their phone, their Okta Verify phone, and then I could send a push notification to it all via the Okta API. And then when I sent a push notification, I received back a bunch of data, and in that data was a URL. It said, hey, keep sending things to this URL, and we'll tell you whether the user has verified that yes, it is them, no, it's not them, or whether they just haven't done anything. And so I was able to utilize that. I was able to loop through that and see when the user had verified it was them. And if they verified it was them, great. I could then go look in Kanji. I could see, oh, what devices are theirs? I could pull their file vault key, and I could send it back to them. But I ran into a little bit of a hiccup. What if a user had more than one device? How did I know which one to send them? I thought at the time, well, I'll just use whatever the most recent device was. That seems like it's right? You know, that seems proper, but turns out that was a pretty bad assumption, and that was another big lesson for me, was not to assume. When I was building things, I really needed to talk to people, the people who were going to use these tools, and find out how they would use them. I needed to get the right data. So I ended up, at the time, just doing well, I'll send them the information for all their devices, and they can kind of choose their own adventure. Obviously, looking back on that, I would have changed that a lot. We don't use this tool anymore for a variety of reasons, but it is something that I would have changed. I would have given them some additional prompts to help sort through which device they needed to unlock so that I didn't send them unnecessary privileged information. And most importantly, it self-destructs at the end. It leaves that file vault key for a set amount of time and then would wipe it. And that is a big lesson we'll talk about in just a moment. Because first, API usage. Like I said, this was really where I was diving in. There are a lot of different types of API calls, which can really be thought of as the type of action you're performing. There's get information to read information. There's post information to post something new. There's put to also put something new. There's patch if you need to change something. And there's delete if you just want it gone. But it wasn't just about what I was sending. It was about what I was receiving back. Like I said, Okta would send me a bunch of information, and then that was a URL, which was super helpful to making sure that they actually verified who they were. Another thing was looping. I needed to loop through results. And it really helped form the connection for me that looping was kind of like a pause button, and I could choose what the unpause button was supposed to read as. So I could loop through all the devices assigned to a user in Kanji. I could loop through results. And I could loop. And I could loop. I think we might be a little stuck in the loop. But then, like I said, we need to wipe secure information. As part of our jobs in IT, we need to help secure information, especially in situations where a user may not know that it's sensitive information. They may not know that that information is an unlocked key to the kingdom. So we need to do our due diligence. We need to understand when we're sending data, what we're going to do with it after the fact as well. We don't just want it out there and say, not our problem. That's going to lead to a lot of bad things. So, like I said, I learned to start taking track of any time I would send data. I made a note of how it was sent and some key information so that I could go either delete it or retrieve it or take some sort of action on it after the fact. I had to really sweep it through. Oh, that's sad, the broom did not. All right. One of my final tools is Lumiere, the director of animate assets. He's a lot of fun. Disney, if you're out there, please don't sue me. So Lumiere was our director of animate assets. And again, it started as the RAMP asset movement pipeline. For my boss out there, you're welcome. So what Lumiere did was he would keep our device management and asset tracking systems fully in sync. There wasn't a native integration at the time, and so we said, well, we don't want to have to keep manually updating things in both systems. Why shouldn't we just be able to automate one to the other? I'm going to do things a little backwards this time and show you kind of what it looks like from the beginning. It's even more of a jumbled mess. There was a lot of custom logic that had to go into this. Things like checking the assigned user and the model identifier and the memory. And it was made even more complicated by Apple's love of using the same identifier for multiple different configurations. For example, MacBook Pro 18,3 can refer to both a 14-inch M1 Pro 16 or 32 gigabyte. Our finance team needed those separate. Those are different costs associated with those machines. And so we needed to make sure that those were separate in our tracking systems. So a lot of custom logic, and that's why there's a lot of different jumbled branching paths here. One of the big lessons I took away from Lumiere was pagination. I had run into it a little bit before, but I really hadn't used it in earnest. So essentially, what happens is an API will only return so many results. In a system like Kanji, where we have several hundred devices, I would only get a subset of those results in the first return. And so what if the device I needed wasn't in there? How did I go find it? What did I do? I wasn't quite sure. And I struggled with it. I said, well, I don't know what's going on here. There's data missing. And so I had to learn to look inside the response. And in that response, there was what's frequently called a next or link value that gave me a new URL. Said, hey, here's your next API call. They did it all for me. It was pretty easy. I just had to pull that URL out and use that for my next API call. And again, I would, once again, loop through that. We're kind of stuck in some loops here. It's a familiar thing. So yeah, we'd loop through all the results until we had the totality of our information. And then great, now that we've got the totality of our information, we can make the proper actions. And then I took the next step, the code aid mixer, if you will. I started to mix a little bit of code and no code. I went a little against my North Star of saying, hey, I want everything under one roof. I said, I need to start doing a little bit more. I need to give people access who don't necessarily have access to these low-code tools. I need to build things for them too. And sometimes Slack was just a little bit too complicated for that, or just wasn't a great use. And so I started to look at other solutions. One of those solutions I ran upon was something that our engineering team had been using internally for quite a few years to build out for our customer support team and our marketing teams, a tool called Retool, which allowed me to both design a really easy interface, but then also have some custom code running on the background. So I got a little bit of the best of both worlds. I got some drag and drop, and I got a little more custom logic. But part of the problem was I needed to write JavaScript. And like I said, I wasn't great at code, and JavaScript wasn't something I had written at all, ever. So there was a lot of Googling, a lot of Stack Overflow, and yes, even some ChatGPT. I don't think you all thought you would get through this without some sort of mention of AI. So what was some of the things I built with that? Well, something like converting Slack channels. We looked at our tickets and we noticed a lot of the tickets that we're having to manually do involve changing a Slack channel from private to public because it's locked down to admin only. I said, well, that seems silly. We shouldn't have to go do that. They should be able to do that whenever they want. So I built a channel manager. And the way it worked is a person would give you a channel ID. It would go invite a bot into the channel and make sure that the user was in the channel. If they weren't in the channel, it would send a message to IT saying, hey, this person might need some help. It looks like they're trying to make a private channel public. But if they were part of that channel, we said, okay, they're authorized. That's an acceptable risk for us. We'll make this public now so the whole company can see it. And it even sends a fun little message in the channel because a random bot showing up in a channel for no reason probably scares some people. We wanted to make sure they knew what was going on. And then we'll talk about my favorite thing I built. Like I said, we'd talk about it later. It is what I call my magnum opus. Pay no attention to the fact that there's black and yellow text. This is, again, I'm so sorry. This is a ridiculous thing I've built. It is the silliest thing I have ever done in my life, but I love it. I present to you the Bee Movie, an Okta workflow. So this came about one day when one of my dear friends in the Mac admin Slack messaged me and he says, hey, do you think we Slack bots could communicate with each other as a sort of API layer? And we mulled it over, we did a little testing, and we came to the conclusion that yes, absolutely, Slack bots can talk to each other and can respond accordingly. So a few weeks later, I was thinking about that conversation. I said, wouldn't it be funny to just have a Slack channel with no humans in it, where there are some Slack bots reading through the Bee Movie script 24/7 for no reason other than it makes me laugh. And so that's what I did. Fun fact, it takes about 2.5 hours for them to complete a read through, so it gets through the movie a couple times a day. Now, I want to clarify, in case my boss is watching out there, I did this on my own time. Sure, I used company infrastructure. Sure, it lives in our Slack. And someday when I leave, I'll giggle about that fact, but it was all on my own. What did I learn from this? Well, not a lot, honestly. And that was important to me too. It was a realization that I didn't have to do things just because they were going to spark the growth. I needed to do things because they needed to be done. This maybe didn't need to be done, but you get the gist of what I'm going for. It still led me to go through the process of building something from scratch, of designing this flow, of figuring out how I was going to make things work, what hurdles I'd run into. And so it still helped solidify some good ideas in my brain. Just maybe it wasn't the most productive. But eventually, I started to write code. Now, this is probably my favorite side because I love this emoji. I take it with me everywhere I go. You may be asking, why move to code? It seems like low code is going well. I'm building tools, they're being used, they're helpful to the company. Why move? Well, I kind of broke it down into 3 major sections. Limitations in the low code architecture, a reliance on vendors for some things, and selfish self-preservation, which is probably the most important. So let's break those down a little bit further. Limitations in the low code architecture. One of the big things was role-based access control. Like I said earlier, sometimes I needed to give someone access to something, and a lot of low-code tools didn't have an idea of role-based access. It was in all or nothing. And so I couldn't limit what people could see. It was full access to a lot of sensitive data. So we had to control that access to people who had access to that data elsewhere anyways. We couldn't just give people these cool tools that we wanted to build or let them start building things themselves. Another thing was data security. As we started to productionalize some of these tools and put things like file vault recovery keys and laptop serial numbers in. We said, well, we don't quite know what agreements we have with these companies as far as data protection goes. We don't know if we have NDAs with them about what they're going to do with this data. We've never put sensitive data in these places before. And so we needed to look at that and say, hey, maybe we need to move this. And then there were just some weird things that happened sometimes. For example, there was an API call that would work great when I ran it as a curl from terminal. It worked perfectly from Postman, and then it just wouldn't work from Okta Workflows, the exact same call. And that struck me as weird, and I realized that sometimes that architecture can create some weird quirks that I don't have really any control over, which feels bad. And also, version control and review was a big one. Obviously, with code, you have peer reviews, you have a lot of version control, you can see what something looked like previous to changes, and a lot of low-code tools don't have that yet. I really think while low-code tools are blossoming, they're a young industry, and a lot of these things are yet to be built out. So I had to start looking elsewhere. Now, the reliance on vendors. Things would break a lot of the time. For example, that weird architecture quirk I was talking about turned out to be something broken on the vendor's end. It's been broken for about 3 months, and I'm still waiting. Nudge, nudge, Welton, I would love a fix. API updates. Sometimes an API would update, and I would have no notice of it. It was a lot easier to adjust for that in code than it was in low code. Low code was a little more static, where code was a little more dynamic. I could build URL formatters. And then test cases. In code, you have traditional test cases where something changes. Great, it's going to run through a gamut of tests for you with a lot of different types of data and different formats of data and tell you what your change broke. Again, low code just doesn't have that yet. If you want to go test, you have to go test yourself most of the time. And so I needed to move. And then finally, selfish self-preservation. Like I said, I saw this shift coming, and it was something that I wanted to be a part of. I said, I have to look out for myself. At the end of the day, we're all responsible for ourselves, and no one will ever be upset at you for that, or shouldn't be upset at you for that. If I wanted to change careers, I needed a viable option. I needed to build a brand. I needed to build a portfolio. So how did I start exactly? Well, pick a language. A lot of people will tell you a lot of different things. They'll say, oh, you should do this because this. You should do this because this. For me, it was very individualized. It depended on the environmental factors that I had around me. I looked at the goals and tasks I was trying to accomplish and wanted to make sure that that language was capable of some of those goals and tasks. Now, I'd argue probably most languages can handle most things, but being new, it was something I was concerned about. And then there was also the utilization of community members. There was whether you have a strong community presence. For the language I chose, which was Go, there was a strong Slack community called the Gophers Slack. And I knew I had both resources internally in engineering and IT, as well as friends outside of my company who were writing in Go. So I knew I would have people to bounce things off. And maybe most importantly, look at how cute that mascot is. There's the reason I chose Go. I mean, come on, he's adorable. But really, after I picked a language, I had to go pick a tool. I needed to find an integrated development environment I enjoyed. I needed to find useful extensions. Now, you'll probably hear from a lot of people, oh, the tools don't matter. You should focus on the foundational skills. I tend to disagree. I think when you have the right tools, it makes it easier to learn, makes it a little more fun for you to learn, too. It just helped solidify things in my brain. With the extensions, there were things that would autocomplete for me. I still needed to know how to start it or what commands to use, but as soon as I started typing something, it would give me the rest. There were things like automatic linters, so while I was doing something, it would highlight and say, hey, this is formatted incorrectly, and as well as things like highlighting text in different colors so I could see which brackets went around which things, which if-else statements were nested inside of each other. It just helped build some of those connections for my brain. But what do you even look for when you're looking for these tools or extensions? I'm gonna give you a bit of the cliche you won't know until you try. But I really found it to be true for me. I asked friends for lists. I spent hours Googling articles on which extensions or which ID, and I found a million different answers. And I went through them all, and I found that maybe 1 out of 10 would work for me or really clicked with me when I tried it. And so I realized, hey, you really can't rely on anyone else to give you that answer. You gotta, your brain works how your brain works, and it's unique, and we're all awesome individuals, so figure it out. It was a lot of fun to go play around, see how different things interacted, see what changed when I did different things. And then there were some healthy coding habits that I picked up along the way. Commenting everything. Seems self-explanatory. We've probably all heard it before. Document everything you do. Consistent formatting. And like I said, that's where the extensions came in for me. I'm not a big document person. I'm not a big, I need to make sure all the spaces are the same. Like, it just doesn't work well for me. So if I had a tool that did that for me and built those brain connections for me, I would see the spacing and I'd recognize it. I could read my code so much quicker than if it was all jumbled together. It really helped kickstart me. Meaningful naming of variables, the don't repeat yourself, and the modularization that we talked about earlier with the low code. I think these are probably all things a lot of people have heard in a lot of aspects of life, and they really did carry over to coding for me. Then there were helpful hints as well. Things like finding a logger that you really enjoy and use it a lot at every opportunity. For me, it was when I was in high school and doing Visual Basic. There was a step-through debugger. I'd hit the F9 key and it would move one line of code forward, and I could go hover over all the variables and see how that line of code had impacted it. I do it a little more advanced these days. I can run the program and have it spit out a lot of logging with just a single line of code. I can see what the error was, where it came from, which part of the code it came from. So it makes it a lot easier when I can just run things. I don't have to go individually each time and check and check and check. And then environment configuration. A lot of times these tools use sensitive data, API keys, secrets, things like that. There are a lot of really cool environment configuration tools out there. One that I use and love, I'm able to store everything inside my macOS keychain, and it reads from that. So I know that it's much more secure than just a plain text file sitting on my disk somewhere. And then there's the actual getting into the code part. Things like learning Git. Git was super important. Git is just an open source version control. I kind of liken it to the suggestions of Google Docs if you've ever used it. You can delete something and it'll show you the line through it, or typing something will appear in a different color, but nothing's really finalized until you actually go press that button. And Git works a lot of the same way. You make all these changes, the original code still exists until you push it and commit it. And a lot of times that involves a peer review to make sure that you're not gonna break everything, because I've broken a few things in my days. But there were also stumbling points along the way, very important stumbling points. Like I talked about, I struggled with this for many years. Code won't be perfect or even good for the first while you write it. Here's an example of bad code right there that it worked, but it probably wasn't the best code. And this was me a lot of the time, screaming because I couldn't figure out what the optimal way to do things was. I really struggled to let it sink into my brain that if it works, it works. The more you do it, the more you're gonna learn. And eventually, you'll learn better habits, and you can go fix things. If it works, that's the important part. But also be willing to abandon a project, which seems a little weird. I'll talk a little bit about that soon. And I know many of you are probably screaming at me, what about AI? Why do I need to learn any of this? ChatGPT is gonna take care of this. And while I think ChatGPT and AI is extremely helpful, I don't think it's here for our jobs anytime soon. There are a lot of intricacies that it can't seem to handle. It builds a really solid foundation. It'll get you 90% of the way there. But you still need to understand what it's doing and what some of the hazards are. If you think about it like building a house, it may look at the history of how houses were built and may decide, wow, lead paint was used for a really long time. I should use lead paint. Nowadays, we know that's not a good idea and that's gonna hurt us. So we need to be able to recognize some of these dangerous things that it might do. And one of the big things is we're going to experience a massive influx of code. There are going to be so many people out there who can't write or read or understand code generating code with AI. Now more than ever, we are in a prime position to be those people who can understand it, who can support it, who can troubleshoot it, and who can take it from that 90% to that 100% of the way. We need people with these foundational skills to help support those who may not. So, you've got the environment, you've got the tools, you've got a couple healthy habits built up. What do? Dive in, honestly. That's what it took for me. I just decided one day, I said, hey, I'm gonna take one of these things and I'm gonna start writing some code. I'm gonna start Googling. I said, I'm gonna pick a project that I've done and move it over. So the first thing I looked at was Lumiere. And I said, well, I really like Lumiere, but he's been broken for a while for reasons outside my control. Maybe I need to rewrite him somewhere else. I need to build him a new house. So I started. But, like I said, abandoning a project can be just as important. About halfway through, some other priorities came up in our company. We had other things that we needed to do that we hadn't yet had a solution for. And so I abandoned the rewrite of Lumiere. But I noticed the next project I went to work on, I got started way faster and way smoother because of the work I had done on Lumiere. Even though I hadn't finished him, I had still learned the skills. I had still learned more of the language syntax and how things worked. And so it made future projects easier without completing it. And one of those things was an internal tool that we call Qbert. And kind of weird, I wrote zero code for Qbert. So why is he in the code section? Well, because of all that work I had done with low code and learning JSON data and learning Slack blocks and Slack bots, I was able to chime in. We have a brilliant CPE named John Mike who wrote all the code for this, but he had never built a Slack bot. So I got to sit in with him a lot and say, hey, this is how a Slack bot should work, or this is what you're missing, or help troubleshoot. And so the whole time I'm doing this, I'm seeing the things he's doing. I'm seeing the code he's writing, and some of it's absorbing into me. Obviously, I don't understand it all, but it's soaking in. I'm seeing the healthy and the good things that he is doing as he's writing code, and it helped me become more and more familiar. The next thing I started working on was a system to sync data from our HR system to our identity platform. We didn't have anything built. There was no native integration. And for a variety of reasons, it was just a mess. So we said, well, I really need that data. When the people team changes someone's manager or their team, I need to know that in our identity platform because that changes their access, changes who notifications go to. I don't want to have them have to submit a ticket, have us go change that manually. And so I built a tool to say, hey, I'm going to loop through all of this information. I'm going to pull all our employees from the HR system, pull all our employees from the identity system, and compare them. It was, again, very similar to Lumiere. Like I said, it was that work that I had done on Lumiere ended up transferring over, and just with people instead of computers this time. And after I had finished this HR tool, I looked back on it and I said, wow, that was a lot easier than years ago when I tried to learn to write code. Why was that? I said, well, all these things that have to do with logic, I had already learned over the past couple years of using low-code tools. So all of a sudden, writing code was just about learning the language. I already knew how to do all this logical stuff. I had built up this logical brain without ever realizing it. But also, like I mentioned, the imperfect code. With that sync between our HR system and our identity platform, the first couple times I ran it, it was taking 10 to 15 minutes to do everything. I thought, well, that's not great. We're only at about 500 people now. As we scale, that's going to get real ugly real fast. And so I went out and I Googled and I found some new code. I said, oh, well, there's this template for how people are doing this. Maybe I can utilize this. And if you can see the comment there on that code, it says, do something I don't yet understand. And that was important for me to realize that I could put things in and start using it and testing and testing. And the more I tested, the more I learned what it was actually doing. Now, granted, take this with a grain of salt, very dangerous to use code you don't know what it's doing, but I also had some backup with our brilliant CPE who said, yeah, that's not dangerous, go for it. So I had some checks and balances there, but it's not bad to go find other code as long as you can test it in a safe environment and learn things. So as I'm kind of wrapping up here over the next couple minutes, briefly go through some of the other things that I've built over the past 6 months to a year and the things they've done for our company. Our CTO came and said, hey, we've got 1,500 Slack channels. It's an absurd number. We don't need that many. I need you to archive any that haven't been used in 90 days. I said, oh God, that's a lot of manual work. I don't want to have to go look through 1,500 channels and figure out how to archive them all. So I built an archiver that would read things like when the last message was sent, and if it was greater than a certain date, it would archive it. But to test that, I needed a lot of channels. I needed to know how to mass archive. So then I had to go build a channel creator. Said, okay, well, how do I go create 200 channels to archive, to test, and make sure this tool that I'm working on works before I start archiving channels? I don't want to archive the wrong channels. Our people team came to us one day and said, hey, we want everyone's Slack picture to put on a slide to celebrate the company anniversary. We said, okay, easy enough. So looped through everyone's Slack and pulled their profile picture and just zipped it into a nice little archive to send over to the people team. And you may be noticing a theme, like I said earlier, a lot of Slack stuff. We kind of live in Slack. And then there was user access review. As the next iteration of the HR system into identity platform sync, I needed to know not only that people were changing teams, but what the teams were changing and what that access might change. So that got a little more advanced, involving databases with what teams had access to what tools were sensitive and may need to be revoked if someone changed teams. And so it was a big matrix that I had to sort through, and got a little more advanced with that. And it was a lot of fun. I've stumbled along the way. There's been a lot of mistakes, broken a few things, but it's been a good time overall. So where do I go from where I'm at right now, about a year into my journey? Well, gonna keep learning Go. I certainly no master at it. If I think I was great at it in a year, I'd be insane. I'm gonna start to branch out into some new languages. Sometimes things are easier or more difficult with different languages, and I wanna experiment with that, see where it might take me, and potentially even do some more things like web app dev. Like I talked about with Retool, sometimes I need just a clean, easy interface for people to use. So why not experiment with that, see what I can do. And as we come to the end here, I need to give a couple big thank yous. My dear friend Jacob Waters from the Mac Admins community has heard me complain and worry and stress about this talk to no end since probably March or April. Thousands of messages of how panicked I am about this talk. So he has been an absolute rock and a great person. He's the one who gave me the idea for the B-movie thing, talking about the Slack bots. So we do a lot of silly things together, and he's a lot of fun. John Peterson, our brilliant CPE at my company, the amount he has taught me in the couple months I've worked with him has just been so insane, and he's been so good at saying, hey, do you want to figure this out yourself? Do you want to stumble through it, or do you want me to show you some stuff? And really helping give me those choices. My colleagues, Anna, Colin, and Simon, when you guys watch this, they're incredible at their jobs. They're so, so good, and I'm so lucky to work with them because I would not have the time to do a lot of this growth without them being so good at what they do. The Mac Admins community at large, a lot of you out here have inspired me with the things you've built, the way we troubleshoot things together in Slack, just the general knowledge and bounce back between each other. And then all of you here in this talk, it's a really cool experience for me. I was originally planning on giving my first talk back in 2020. I had everything planned out, and then the pandemic hit. So this has been a long time coming for me to do my first presentation, and to have a room this large filled with people feels really good. So thank you all for coming, and I really hope at least one of you got at least one idea out of this talk. And then, of course, any questions? All right, way in the back. I'm gonna run this back to you because I cannot throw that far.
I was wondering if your B-movie Slackbot was open source.
It is not currently. I'll spill the secret sauce. It's essentially just a big table with the character and the line, and then it just loops through that table and says, oh, who's the character? That determines which Slackbot needs to send it. So overall, pretty easy. Weirdly enough, someone at the University of Washington is hosting the B-movie script as a text file online, and so that's where I grabbed it from, and then just coincidentally used ChatGPT to turn it into tabular form, splitting the character and line. But
Yeah, well, sometimes a simple example is helpful.
yeah, yep, absolutely.
Very cool. Anybody else?
Looks like
Be tossed. Great presentation. I was curious, with all the tools you were building, did you ever look at any automated documentation, like read the docs or anything like this?
I haven't yet. Part of it for me was the idea that having to write these things out and explain them to anybody would really help solidify a lot of the ideas for me. So as I grow more and become more familiar, yeah, I may move into something a little bit more automated, but right now it's, you know, that classic writing things helps you learn. And so it was very intentional that I choose to still write the docs for my team and outward facing.
Cool. Should I throw it all the way back to the front?
Looks like we might be set, so. All right, again, thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Safe journey home if you're going anywhere that's not here, which I assume most of us are. So have a great day, everybody.